The brass award slammed into the attacker's skull, my father's last trophy, now a weapon. The masked intruder lunged again, but I barely dodged, my back hitting the wall. The burner phone in my pocket buzzed with one name: Committee. Someone inside my own circle just tried to kill me. The war for $3 billion had begun, and I was already bleeding. 30 days to prove I'm worthy. 30 days to survive. The mirror in my father's study reflected a man on the brink. But the real fight wasn't in the glass. It was in the shadows, where the Sterling Empire's secrets waited to bury me. The scent of old parchment and expensive tobacco clung to the heavy curtains of the study, a smell that Julian Sterling had always associated with the slow, suffocating weight of his father's expectations. He gripped the mahogany armrests of the high-backed chair, the grain of the wood digging into his palms like a dull blade. Across the desk, Robert Vance adjusted his spectacles, the glass catching the morning sun and casting twin glares that obscured the man's eyes. Robert slid a document toward them, the paper crisp and white against the dark, polished wood. Claire sat rigid beside Julian. Her perfume, something sharp, floral, and aggressively expensive, clashed with the room's musty, stagnant air. She did not reach for the folder. Instead, she watched Robert's thin lips, her own jaw set in a line so tight it looked painful. Julian could hear the faint, rhythmic whisper of her breath. He knew she was counting the seconds, or perhaps the books on the shelves, or the floorboards beneath her feet. A secret committee, Robert said, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves skittering across pavement. 30 days of observation. Your conduct, your choices, and your ability to maintain the sterling image will dictate the inheritance. $3 billion or nothing. Julian's throat tightened, the air in the room suddenly feeling thin. He focused on a single brass button on Robert's vest, trying to steady his heart. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked, a rhythmic hammer against the silence. This was not the reading of a will. It was a cage. So we are lab rats now? Claire's voice cracked, though she smoothed her silk skirt with practiced grace, her fingers trembling just enough for Julian to notice. Robert leaned forward, his shadow stretching across the legal jargon printed on the page. Think of it as a trial. The Sterling estate requires a steady hand, not a squandered legacy. The observers are already in place. They see what you do when you think you are alone. Julian stared at his sister's reflection in the polished surface of the desk. Her jaw remained set, a muscle leaping in her cheek. They were no longer heirs. They were rivals trapped in a house of eyes. Robert stood, his leather briefcase clicking shut with a finality that echoed through the hollow room. The game had begun, before Julian could even find his breath. As Robert exited, the heavy oak door thudded shut, leaving Julian and Claire in a silence that felt heavy enough to bruise. Julian did not look at her. He could not. He stood up, the metal of his cufflinks clicking against the wood, a cold, mechanical sound. He needed to move. He needed to act. The thought of Claire's eyes on his back, counting his steps, made the skin between his shoulder blades itch. He walked out of the study, his mind already calculating the first move in a war that had been simmering since they were children. The afternoon sun was a harsh, unforgiving glare as Julian steered his silver coupe toward a neglected stretch of the shoreline, far from the manicured lawns of the Sterling estate. He pulled into the gravel lot of a shuttered bait shop, the tires crunching loudly in the salt-heavy air. Gary Miller was already there. Leaning against a rusted sedan, the scent of stale cigarettes and cheap mints preceding him. Gary cracked his knuckles, a sound like dry twigs snapping, and reached into his pocket. Julian stepped out of his car, adjusting his suit jacket. He felt the heat radiating from the asphalt, a shimmering haze that made the horizon wobble. "You are late, Gary," Julian said, his voice clipped and precise. "And you're desperate, Mr. Sterling. That makes us even." Gary pulled out a small, crinkled sugar packet from his pocket, turning it over in his grimy fingers. "I heard about the old man's stunt. A committee? Sounds like a lot of work for a guy who's already dead." Julian ignored the jab. "I need you to get into Claire's office. I want ears in every corner, every phone call, every whisper, every clicking of her heels as she counts her way across the floor. I want it recorded." Gary chuckled, the sound ending in a wet cough. "Breaking and entering into a Sterling-owned skyscraper? That's a high-priced ticket, Julian. The security there is like a fortress. They have those sensors that can smell a flea on a dog's back." "I am not asking for your opinion on the difficulty," Julian snapped. He reached into his breast pocket and produced an envelope, thick with cash. "I am asking for results. Use the vents, use the service elevator, use a bribe. I do not care. Just ensure that by tomorrow morning, I am hearing everything she says." Gary took the envelope, his fingers lingering on the paper. He tucked it away and pulled out another sugar packet, this one labeled Diner 57, November 12th. "You're the boss. But remember, kid, once you start digging in the dirt, you can't complain when you get some under your fingernails." Julian watched Gary drive away, the exhaust from the sedan hanging in the damp air. He felt a flicker of something, not guilt, but a cold, analytical satisfaction. This was the logical path. To win, he had to know the enemy's hand. He was being smart. He was being the man his father had raised him to be. Subverted beat. The logic was sound. Gary Miller was a ghost, a man who lived in the shadows and knew how to bypass the most intricate locks. If Julian could hear Claire's private conversations, he would know exactly how she planned to sway the committee. He would have the leverage to disqualify her before the 30 days were even half over. It was a tactical necessity, a move of pure competence. Julian felt a rare moment of optimism as he drove back toward the Hamptons. He was taking control. He was the architect of his own victory. By the following evening, Julian sat in his private study, a pair of high-end headphones pressed against his ears. At first, there was only static, the white noise of an empty room. Then he heard it, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of Claire's heels. He heard her voice, low and melodic, as she dictated notes to her assistant. "It's working," Julian whispered to the empty room. He leaned back, his shoulders finally dropping from their permanent hunch. He felt a surge of relief so potent it made his hands tremble. He had outplayed her. He had a direct line into the heart of her operation. He listened as she discussed a merger, a charity lunch, and a meeting with their father's old associates. It was all mundane, but it was his. He was winning. But then, the audio changed. The sound grew muffled, as if the microphone was being moved. Julian frowned, pressing the headphones tighter against his skull. He heard a metallic scrape, then a voice he didn't recognize, a deep, gravelly tone that didn't belong to any of Claire's staff. "Is it secure?" the voice asked. "Completely," Claire replied, her voice closer now, as if she were speaking directly into the bug. "He thinks he's so clever. He thinks Gary Miller works for him." Julian's heart skipped a beat. A cold prickle of sweat broke out across his forehead. He reached for the volume knob, turning it until the static hissed like a snake. "The feed is being diverted," the gravelly voice said. "He's listening to exactly what we want him to hear. And while he's distracted by this little show, The committee is receiving the logs of his illegal surveillance. He's handing them the rope to hang himself. Julian ripped the headphones off, the plastic snapping in his grip. The room felt suddenly, violently cold. He hadn't just failed. He had been led into a slaughterhouse. Gary Miller hadn't been his weapon. Gary had been the bait. By hiring a private investigator to bug his sister, Julian had violated the very morality the committee was supposed to be judging. He had provided the evidence of his own corruption, recorded in high definition, and handed it directly to the people who held his future in their hands. He stood up, his chair screeching against the floorboards. But there was nowhere to run. The walls of the mansion seemed to pulse with the unseen presence of the observers, laughing at the man who thought he was a predator, only to find he was the prey. The weight of the betrayal felt like a physical blow to his chest, making every breath a struggle. Julian paced the length of the darkened hallway, his footsteps echoing against the cold marble. The burner phone he had used to contact Gary felt heavy in his pocket, a piece of lead that threatened to pull him under. He needed to think. He needed to find a way to scrub the record, to erase the digital footprint he had so confidently left behind. As he turned the corner toward the grand staircase, a shadow detached itself from the gloom. It happened in a blur of motion. A figure, dressed in charcoal gray, and wearing a mask that obscured everything but a pair of cold, dead eyes, lunged at him. Julian gasped, the air leaving his lungs as a shoulder slammed into his solar plexus. He hit the wall hard, the plaster cracking behind his head. "Who are you?" Julian wheezed, but the intruder didn't answer. A gloved hand gripped Julian's throat, squeezing until the world began to dim at the edges. Julian clawed at the assailant's wrists, his fingers finding only the rough texture of a tactical jacket. He was losing. His vision flickered, the hallway spinning in a sickening kaleidoscope of shadows. His hand swept across a small pedestal nearby, his fingers closing around the cold, heavy base of a brass award. A trophy his father had won for corporate excellence. With a guttural snarl, Julian swung the award. The metal connected with the side of the intruder's head with a sickening thud. The grip on his throat loosened instantly. Julian didn't stop. He swung again, the brass whistling through the air, catching the man across the ribs. He heard the distinct pop of a bone breaking. The intruder stumbled back, a low groan escaping the mask. He didn't try to continue the fight. Instead, he scrambled toward the large bay window at the end of the hall. With a desperate heave, the man threw himself through the glass. The shatter was deafening, 1,000 diamonds exploding into the night air. Julian lunged forward, reaching for the man's jacket, but his fingers only brushed against something small and hard that slipped out of the intruder's pocket. Julian stood at the broken window, his chest heaving, the cold night air rushing in to fill the hallway. Below, in the darkness of the gardens, the intruder vanished into the hedges. Julian looked down at his hand. He wasn't holding a piece of clothing. He was holding a burner phone, its screen cracked but still glowing. He retreated from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He sat on the floor, ignoring the shards of glass that bit into his trousers. His hands shook as he swiped the screen of the captured phone. It wasn't locked. Julian's breath hitched. He scrolled through the recent calls. There were no names, only numbers. Except for one. A contact labeled committee. The realization hit him like a plunge into icy water. The observers weren't just watching from a distance. They were here, in his house, trying to kill him or break him. They were part of the architecture of the Sterling estate. He checked the outgoing messages. Subject 1 shows high levels of aggression. Physical intervention required. Julian felt a wave of nausea. Subject 1. He was a line of data in a report. He looked at the last outgoing call. It had been made only minutes ago. The committee wasn't a group of elders in a boardroom. They were hunters. And the phone in his hand was the first piece of real evidence he had ever held. He tucked it into his inner pocket, the cold metal a small comfort against his racing heart. He wasn't just fighting Claire anymore. He was fighting a ghost that lived in his own home. The next morning, the world felt tilted. Julian stood in the executive boardroom of the Sterling Corporation, the glass walls offering a panoramic view of Manhattan that felt more like a prison wall than a vista. The air in the room was thick with the scent of industrial ozone and the metallic tang of fear. Across the long obsidian table sat the board of directors, their faces as stony and unyielding as the buildings outside. Michael Davis, the board's unofficial leader, slammed a tabloid newspaper onto the table. The headline screamed in bold, black ink, "The high-flying heir's low-life habits." Below it was a photo of Julian's private safe, swung open to reveal a collection of glass vials and white powder. "Explain this, Julian," Michael boomed, his voice vibrating through the floorboards. He began to hum, a low, haunting funeral dirge that Julian recognized from a dozen previous executions. Julian felt his face go pale. That safe was in a locked room, behind a painting. These photos were taken illegally. The legality of the photography is not the concern of this board. Michael snapped, his humming growing louder, a rhythmic drone that made Julian's teeth ache. The concern is the morality clause in your contract. The Sterling name is being dragged through the gutter. We have a fiduciary duty to protect the brand from liabilities. Julian looked around the room. He saw no allies. Even the people he had bribed over the years were looking at their shoes. The no red rule he followed, his refusal to even look at a steak or a glass of wine, wasn't enough to save him now. They saw the red in the scandal, and they wanted him gone. "I am being framed," Julian said, his voice steady despite the roar of blood in his ears. Your sister is currently closing the Mid-Atlantic merger," Michael interrupted. "While you are busy defending your drug habits, we are calling for an emergency vote on your removal as acting CEO. You have 48 hours to provide a clean drug test and a public apology, or you are out. The committee is watching, Julian, and they do not like what they see." Julian walked out of the boardroom, the sound of Michael's humming following him like a curse. He felt the eyes of every assistant and clerk on him, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. He needed a win. He needed to change the narrative. The Sterling Museum was a cathedral of glass and steel, a monument to the family's vanity. Tonight, it was filled with the glitterati of New York, all gathered for the annual Sterling Charity Gala. Julian moved through the crowd, his tuxedo a suit of armor, his face a mask of practiced confidence. He shook hands, he laughed at jokes that weren't funny, and he avoided the buffet tables where the red sauces were served. But the air felt heavy, charged with a static he couldn't explain. He noticed a waiter lingering too long near his elbow, the man's eyes fixed not on the drinks, but on Julian's face. He saw a woman in a silk gown holding her phone at an angle that suggested she was recording his every word. "They're everywhere," Julian muttered to himself. He retreated toward the balcony, seeking a moment of cool air. A hand touched his arm. He nearly jumped out of his skin. It was Sarah Johnson, a young journalist he had seen at a dozen press conferences. Her fingers were stained with ink, and she looked at him with a wide-eyed, frantic energy. "Mr. Sterling, it's a beautiful event, you know," she said, her voice a nervous twitter. "But people are talking about the photos, you know. They say the committee is already leaning toward Claire, you know? Julian felt the walls of the museum closing in. The high-pitched feedback from the sound system, a sound only he seemed to hear, pierced through his brain like a needle. The committee will make their decision based on facts, Sarah, not rumors. But the facts look bad, you know? She pressed, leaning closer. And the way you're sweating, it makes you look guilty, you know? Julian's heart began to race. The lights of the gala blurred into long, jagged streaks of gold. He couldn't breathe. The scent of the lilies, sprayed with that cloying, artificial rot, filled his lungs. He pushed past her, stumbling toward the restrooms. He locked himself in a marble stall, his chest heaving. He was having a panic attack, a physical collapse of his carefully constructed world. He looked down at his hands. They were vibrating, a sign of instability he couldn't control. He was Subjects 1, and he was failing. He stayed in the stall for an hour, listening to the muffled sounds of the party outside. When he finally emerged, the gala was winding down. He drove back to the mansion in a daze, the road a dark ribbon under the moonlight. When he reached his bedroom, he didn't even turn on the lights. He just wanted to sleep, to escape the eyes for a few hours. He closed the heavy oak door and heard a sound that made his blood run cold. Click. He lunged for the handle. It wouldn't budge. He pulled with all his might, the wood groaning, but the deadbolt on the outside had been thrown. "Open the door!" Julian shouted, pounding his fist against the paneling. There was no answer. He turned around, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. And then he saw it. A tiny, glowing red dot in the corner of the ceiling. A security camera lens, its unblinking eye fixed on him. He was trapped. He spent the night pacing the small square of carpet, the red light following his every move. He shouted, he pleaded, and eventually, he sat in the corner and wept, knowing that somewhere, in a room he couldn't find, the committee was watching his breakdown and marking it down as a final, pathetic failure. The morning light brought no relief, only a cold, gray reality. The door was unlocked as silently as it had been bolted, leaving Julian to wonder if he had imagined the whole ordeal. But the red eye in the ceiling remained, a silent witness to his humiliation. He needed to get away. He needed to think. He grabbed his keys and headed for the Hampton safe house, a small cottage tucked away behind towering privet hedges. As he drove, his eyes constantly flicked to the rearview mirror. A black SUV appeared 3 cars back. It stayed there through every turn, every lane change. Julian's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. He accelerated, the engine of his coupe roaring. The SUV matched his speed. He was on a narrow, winding road, the hedges on either side creating a green tunnel. The SUV lunged forward, its bumper slamming into Julian's rear. The impact jerked his head back, the sound of crumpling metal echoing through the cabin. "You want to fight?" Julian hissed, his teeth bared. The SUV rammed him again, harder this time. Julian's car spun, the tires shrieking as they lost their grip on the asphalt. He saw the ditch approaching, a deep, muddy trench filled with jagged rocks. He braced himself as the car soared into the air, the world flipping upside down. The crash was a symphony of violence. Glass shattered, metal groaned, and then there was a sudden, heavy silence, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine. Julian crawled out of the wreckage, his suit ruined, his face streaked with blood and mud. He scrambled into the ditch, his fingers clawing at the wet earth. The SUV stopped. A man stepped out, carrying a heavy iron tire iron. He didn't say a word. He just started down into the ditch. Julian didn't wait. He lunged upward, using the momentum of his fear. He tackled the man, the two of them rolling into the muck. The man swung the tire iron, the metal whistling past Julian's ear and burying itself in the mud. Julian punched him, a raw, unrefined strike that caught the man in the throat. They fought like animals, slipping and sliding in the filth. Julian felt a surge of adrenaline that burned away the pain. He grabbed a heavy stone from the bottom of the ditch and slammed it down on the man's hand. The tire iron fell. Julian didn't stay to see the man's face. He scrambled up the bank, his lungs burning, and ran. He didn't look back until he reached a gas station a mile away. He stood under the harsh fluorescent lights, a broken, muddy wreck of a man, and realized that the war had moved beyond boardrooms and wills. It was a matter of survival now. He called Gary Miller from a payphone, his voice shaking. "Meet me in Central Park, now." The park was a vast, hostile space under the city lights. Julian sat on a bench, his head down, trying to look like just another homeless soul. Gary appeared from the shadows, his rumpled appearance fitting right in. He sat down and pulled out a sugar packet, the crinkle of the paper loud in the stillness. "You look like hell, Julian," Gary said, his voice unusually soft. "The files you found on Claire," Julian whispered. "The ones that showed she was stealing from the estate. Where did they come from, Gary?" Gary sighed, a long, weary sound. He didn't look at Julian. "I didn't find them, kid. They were left for me, in a locker at the bus station. A key showed up in my mail with a note saying it was exactly what you needed." Julian felt the world tilt again. "You mean they were planted?" "Yeah. Someone wanted you to have them. Someone wanted you to use them against her." Gary cracked his knuckles. "I think we're both being played, Julian. This whole thing, it's a setup." Julian stood up, the damp air of the park clinging to his skin. He knew now what he had to do. He didn't need the committee's approval. He needed the truth. And the truth was hidden in the one place he hadn't dared to look. Robert Vance's private office. The law office was a tomb of mahogany and silence. Julian moved through the shadows, his movements fluid and silent. He had spent his life learning how to navigate the corridors of power, and tonight, that knowledge was his only weapon. He reached Robert's desk and knelt, his fingers finding the underside of the heavy wood. He pressed a small, high-tech audio bug into the grain, the adhesive sticking with a satisfying click. He moved to the filing cabinets, his penlight a tiny beam of hope in the darkness. He searched for a name, a list, anything that would identify the committee. He found a folder labeled Sterling, Final Disposition. His heart hammered as he opened it. Inside, there were no names. There were only photos. Photos of him in the mud, photos of him in the bathroom stall, photos of Claire counting the stairs, and a single note, written in his father's precise, elegant script. "The trial is not of their actions. It is of their souls. Ensure they reach the breaking point." Asterisk, Julian froze. His father had been dead for weeks, but the note was fresh. He heard a floorboard creak behind him. He turned, his heart in his throat, but the room was empty. Only the green-shaded banker's lamp flickered, its rhythmic pulse forcing him to blink in sync with the light. He wasn't alone. He was never alone. The following morning, the air in the Sterling mansion was thick with the scent of impending rain. Julian sat in the library, the high ceilings making him feel small and exposed. Claire entered, her face a mask of porcelain calm, but her eyes were red-rimmed. She carried a thick manila folder. "It's over, Julian," she said, her voice a soft, lethal whisper. She dropped the folder on the table between them. Julian didn't open it. What is this, Claire? More planted evidence? It's a police report, she said. From 3 years ago. A hit and run in East Hampton. A young woman was left in a ditch with a broken spine. The car was registered to a shell company you controlled. The driver was never found. Until now. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. The memory, a dark night, a sudden impact, the panic that had clouded his judgment, surfaced like a bloated corpse. How did you get this? The committee gave it to me, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. They want to see what I'll do with it. And what I'm going to do is give you a choice. Sign this waiver renouncing your claim to the estate, or I take this to the district attorney. You'll spend the rest of your life in a cell, Julian, counting the bars instead of your money. Julian looked at the folder, then at his sister. He saw the desperation behind her cold exterior. She wasn't winning. She was just as trapped as he was. They're playing us, Claire. They gave you this because they want us to destroy each other. Don't you see that? I see a way to win, she snapped. Sign the paper. Julian stood up, his jaw set. No. I'm going to find out who is really running this show. And when I do, I'm coming for all of you. He walked out, the burner phone in his pocket vibrating. A text message appeared on the screen. Penthouse 42B. The decision is made. Julian drove to Manhattan like a man possessed. He reached the penthouse, a glass-walled fortress overlooking Central Park. He bypassed the security with a code he had found in Vance's office, a code that shouldn't have worked, but did. He stepped into the penthouse and stopped. The walls were covered in monitors. Every room in the Sterling mansion, every corner of his office, even the interior of his car. It was all there, a grid of surveillance that made his skin crawl. Welcome to the war room, a voice said. Gary Miller stepped out from behind a bank of servers. He wasn't wearing his rumpled suit. He was in tactical gear, his face hard and unforgiving. You, Julian whispered. You've been working for them the whole time. I work for whoever pays the most, Julian, and the committee has very deep pockets. Gary cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing in the sterile room. You weren't supposed to find this place, but now that you have, I can't let you leave. Gary lunged, his movement explosive. Julian dodged, the two men crashing into a desk. They fought with a visceral, bone-breaking intensity. Julian felt a rib crack as Gary slammed him into a wall. He fought back with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. They spilled out onto the balcony, 40 stories above the park. The wind whipped around them, the city lights a blur of motion. Julian grabbed a heavy glass ashtray from a side table and smashed it into Gary's face. Gary stumbled back, his heel catching on the edge of the railing. Tell me, Julian screamed, pinning Gary against the glass. Who is the committee? Gary spat blood, a jagged grin stretching across his face. There is no committee, Julian. There never was. Julian froze. What? The master files, Gary wheezed, pointing toward a hidden wall safe inside. Everything is in there, the whole joke. Go ahead, see for yourself. Julian shoved Gary aside and ran to the safe. He punched in the code, his father's birthday, and the door swung open. Inside was a single thumb drive and a stack of financial documents. He grabbed them, his heart racing. This was it, the evidence that would ruin Claire and prove his innocence. Subverted beat, Julian felt a surge of pure, unadulterated triumph. He had the files. He had outfought Gary Miller, he had found the war room, and he held the keys to the kingdom in his hand. This was the moment of total victory. He would take these documents to Robert Vance, present them to the board, and Claire would be the one facing a prison cell. He could almost taste the victory. It was sweet, like the sugar packets Gary obsessed over. He was the smarter sibling. He was the true heir. He drove to the Sterling Corporation headquarters, his mind already drafting his victory speech. He burst into the boardroom, where Robert Vance and the entire board were waiting. Claire was there too, looking defeated and small in her large leather chair. "I have the evidence," Julian shouted, slamming the documents onto the table. "Claire has been funneling money into offshore accounts for years. She's been laundering the estate's liquid assets to build her own empire. It's all here. The signatures, the bank codes, everything." Robert Vance picked up the top sheet, his expression unreadable. He adjusted his spectacles and began to read. The board members leaned in, their faces filled with anticipation. Julian looked at Claire and smiled, a cold, predatory expression. He had won. But as Robert continued to read, his brow furrowed. He looked up at Julian, then back at the paper. "Julian, do you know what these are?" "Evidence of Claire's crimes," Julian said, his voice brimming with confidence. "No," Robert said, his voice a low, mournful rasp. "These are records of your offshore accounts. These are the logs of the money you moved out of the Sterling Trust last year. And this thumb drive. It contains the encryption keys to the very accounts the FBI has been investigating." Julian's smile vanished. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. That's impossible. I didn't move that money. I was looking for Claire's." "You just handed us a confession," Michael Davis said, his humming starting up again, a low, rhythmic dirge that sounded like a shovel hitting dirt. "You brought the evidence of your own tax evasion and money laundering directly into this room. You've done our work for us, Julian." Julian looked at Claire. She wasn't looking at him with defeat. She was looking at him with a cold, terrifying pity. "I didn't plant those files in the penthouse, Julian," she said softly. "The committee did. They knew you'd go looking for a way to ruin me. They knew you'd grab whatever you found and run with it without checking the details. You were so blinded by the need to win that you walked right into the trap." The truth hit Julian like a physical blow. The penthouse hadn't been a war room. It had been a stage. Gary Miller hadn't been guarding the truth. He had been guarding the bait. And Julian, in his desperate, arrogant pursuit of victory, had swallowed it whole. He had handed his enemies the very weapon they needed to destroy him. He stood in the center of the room, the walls of the corporation he had hoped to lead, closing in like the bars of a cage. The lobby of the Sterling building was suddenly swarming with police. Julian saw the flashing blue and red lights through the glass doors, a color he couldn't push away this time. "Julian Sterling?" a detective asked, stepping forward with a pair of silver handcuffs. Julian didn't fight. He didn't even speak. He felt a strange, hollow numbness spreading through his limbs. He looked back and saw Claire standing in the shadows of the mezzanine, holding a signed document, the waiver he had refused to sign, now rendered unnecessary by his arrest. She had won it all. The holding cell was a cold, sterile box that smelled of bleach and old sweat. Julian sat on the narrow cot, the rhythmic dripping of a leaky faucet the only sound in the silence. He had been there for 6 hours when the heavy steel door groaned open. Robert Vance stepped inside, his silver hair gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. He looked older, tired. "The board has met," Robert said, his voice echoing against the cinder block walls. "You are being disinherited, Julian, effective immediately. Your accounts have been frozen, and your assets are being seized to pay back the trust. Julian didn't look up. And Claire? Claire is the sole heir, Robert said. But there's a catch. She has purchased your personal debts. She is now your primary creditor. If you are ever released, you will be working for her. She owns the clothes on your back, Julian. Julian let out a short, dry laugh. Our father would have loved this. The ultimate humiliation. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small micro-recorder he had kept hidden during the gala. He had recorded the committee messages he had heard through the bugs. Listen to this, Robert, Julian said, pressing play. The voice that came out of the small speaker was dry, precise, and unmistakably Arthur Sterling's. Subject 1 has reached the breaking point. Proceed to final liquidation. Julian looked at the lawyer. I've been analyzing the syntax, the word choices, the way he pauses before a hard consonant. This isn't a live recording, Robert. This was made years ago. My father didn't leave a committee. He left a script. Robert's face went pale. He sat down on the edge of the cot, his hands trembling. He made me promise. He said it was a fail-safe. I didn't know he had recorded everything. I thought I was following his ghost. There is no ghost, Julian said. Just a dead man who knew exactly how to make us destroy ourselves. Call Claire. Tell her to come to the house. I have one last thing to show both of you. The study of the Sterling estate was exactly as they had left it, except for the shattered mirror on the wall. Julian stood before the jagged shards, his reflection broken into a dozen different versions of himself. Claire stood by the door, her hair pulled back so tight her eyes looked haunted. Why are we here, Julian? She asked, her voice trembling. I have work to do. I have an empire to run. You have nothing, Claire, Julian said. He pointed to the recording device on the desk. Listen to the man who loved us. He played the final recording, the one he had found hidden in the digital metadata of the committee logs. If you are hearing this, Arthur's voice rasped, it means you have both failed. It means you chose greed over blood and suspicion over loyalty. You have proven that you are exactly what I raised you to be. Hollow. Therefore, the final stipulation of my will is triggered. The Sterling estate is to be liquidated entirely. The money will go to a trust for the families of the people our corporation has stepped on over the last 40 years. You are both dismissed. The silence that followed was absolute. Robert Vance bowed his head, his fingers tracing the edge of the mahogany desk he had served for 4 decades. It's true, Robert whispered. The moral test wasn't about being good. It was about being together. If you had stood by each other, the money would have stayed. But you didn't. You fought. And in fighting, you lost everything. Claire sank into a chair, her hand going to her throat. $3 billion. Gone? Every cent, Julian said. He looked at his sister, and for the first time in 20 years, he didn't see a rival. He saw a mirror. They were both broken, both penniless, and both finally free from the weight of their father's shadow. Outside, the legal teams were already arriving, their black cars lining the driveway like a funeral procession. They began to carry out the paintings, the statues, the very furniture Julian had grown up with. Julian and Claire stood on the darkened porch, watching as their world was packed into crates. The air smelled of wet earth and the salt of the nearby sea. What do we do now? Claire asked, her voice a low, rhythmic whisper. 1, 2, 3. I don't know where the next step is. Julian looked at her, then at his own stained, trembling hands. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have a strategy. For the first time in his life, he didn't have a single figure to balance. "I think," Julian said, his voice surprisingly steady, "we start by learning how to walk without counting the steps." He reached out and took her hand. It was cold, but it was real. They stood together in the ruins of their legacy. Two subjects who had finally failed the test, only to realize that the failure was the only honest thing their father had ever given them. The sterling name was gone, but as they walked down the drive toward the gate, the shadows of the mansion finally stayed behind them.